What can you tell us about these new lines of communication? Some people are getting pretty excited about them.
Well, sure. So the current era of engagement is mostly going to function as a bit of basic maintenance in economic and diplomatic issues. I can tell you from the Chinese perspectives I've been reading that Janet Yellen, our Treasury Secretary's visit, was one that was really paid attention to a lot in Chinese circles because of this perception of an economic warming. Chinese firms' confidence is really sensitive to these types of changes. And of course, American um, firms and trading associations are paying a lot of attention to the prospects of a thaw in economic relations.
The question is what this really means. What are the tangibles? Because it's one thing for Presidents Biden and Xi to meet last year. Did they not meet? And they talked about making sure that their relations didn't go any worse than a particular flaw. They said there's going to be a flaw in
Mm-hmm.
the harm that we can do to each other, and we're not going to make any mistakes. We're not going to veer into conflict. But what about the tangibles? Where is the potential room for compromise?
So typically when people think of, what's a platonic ideal of the US-China relations, they think about the 2000s, the early 2000s to early 2010s era, when you had more diplomatic leeway, when you had the sort of amount of engagement with around the time of the Beijing Olympics. However, presently the stakes are that the United States really wants to assert a very Western-centric rules-led order, whereas the Chinese government, its highest interests are to assert Chinese interests and security priorities,
It's
which
interesting that you
include
framed it as Western rules based, as if the Chinese approach is not based on rules. It's just different rules, isn't it?
it is different rules. I use that term because it's something that if you listen to enough State Department spokespeople, the phrase kind of gets hammered into your head.
I see you're smiling. This
Um,
is that term, the rules-based international order, isn't it? Where there's
it's
Chinese talk about moving from a unipolar to a multipolar world order.
well, the Chinese Foreign Ministry tends to emphasize the notion of sovereignty,
Yeah.
as opposed to collective rules-based systems. And so the assertion of Chinese interests and security priorities is something that the Chinese Foreign Ministry emphasizes. So speaking of which, I'd like to make a point that right now, the political environments in the United States and China are they're in a bit of a state of flux.
Yeah.
She has just faced a pretty significant political shakeup in the abrupt removal of his recently appointed foreign minister, who was previously ambassador to the United States on behalf of China. This is something that it does not happen often. We still don't know why he was removed, but it is one of the bigger risks that kind of is posed to Xi's handpicked circle of loyalists. Now, he's not really any political danger, but this is something very unusual. Of course, Biden is facing 2024, but we knew that. Um, and my reason for making this point is that these types of changes make it so that Washington and Beijing are more likely going to favor maintaining some sort of status quo, even if it's not the good feelings of the early 2000s.
Yeah. At the same time, though, we've got President Biden poised to unveil an executive order restricting US investment into sectors of Chinese affairs with military or Chinese business with military applications. That's one thing. We've had the concern about so-called spy balloons, and now two US Navy sailors charged with spying for China, and then China becoming increasingly concerned about US interests in Taiwan and making it clear there's still no limit to the extent of partnership with Russia. How does one disentangle all of this?
Like I said earlier, the good feelings of the early 2000s is not something that's within reach. I think that right now in the forefront of diplomatic planning is this sense of pragmatism. It's like, what can we actually get at the table? And so as a result, what happens is is very much an era of competition. Last year, Biden's Commerce Department unveiled a series of restrictions on Chinese technological sectors, including what kind of talent and hiring practices that American firms are allowed to take. And so this sense of and likewise in China, the sense of, well, we need to really be self-sufficient from the Americans in terms of our supply chain. That has been an undercurrent to both the positive and the negative fluctuations of US-China policy. So I think both sides are really hedging their bets and hunkering down for more diplomatic lean times, even if they are pressing for smaller positive gains at the negotiation table.
Right. So we've had the recent visits of the Treasury Secretary, Janet Yellen, you mentioned, and of course, Antony Blinken, Secretary of State, visited in June, and the Commerce Secretary, Gina Raimondo, will soon go. As a result of that, we've got these two working groups. These are the tangibles, focusing on regional issues and maritime issues. How long should we give these working groups before saying it's yet more talk?
Well, that's a very good question. And I'm really curious to know what kind of really lasting institutional structures get out of this. Because at the end of the day, the biggest costs that are in US-China bilateral policy, they're not really paid by these high-level politicians. They're paid by people that are trying to do business overseas, to do trade, to, of course, engage in the US-China supply chain, which is not just limited to the scope of the two countries, but has implications on the international economy. It's the big flow of students between China and the United States, and exchanges, these types of people to people relations, which not always first considered, but this type of uh, mutual learning about each other has been one of the safeguards against excessive nationalism. We're starting to see that really slip in this current time of competition.
Indeed. But at the same time, I'm just looking at the US Trade Representative website. US goods and services trade with China totaled an estimated $615.2 billion in 2020. Exports, $164.9 billion. Imports, $450.4 billion. A huge trade imbalance there. But it means that people, despite all of this saber rattling, all of these noises off, all of these difficulties and tensions between governments, are still doing business.
I mean, yeah, China is still the place to go for certain types of specific manufacturing, and for China, they still have not developed certain advanced technologies, pharmaceuticals, um, semiconductors, especially, has been a hot topic, and not just development, but the maintenance of the equipment needed to keep these technologies in production efficiently. That's something that they very much still depend on the United States for. So it's certainly more stressful to do business, but business is still going.